Hi, and welcome to syn101, class number 9. We're going to get in some more advanced topics, or advanced beginning topics. Today we're going to work on a shot that has a lot of distortion in it. And that's something we saw a little bit of in past things as well. But we're going to take a look at how to deal with this distortion, especially this huge distortion that's visible in the shot. And the whole process from tracking to discovering the distortion that you have in the scene. And then finally, how to undistort it, do your CGI and do your renders and do your tracking and so forth, and then distort it back so that you're matching your original shot that you had that you were provided with, because obviously you can't just remove distortion in shots. So if we look at the scene, we've got a normal scene here that's provided with a class. It's 266 frame sequence. Now, it's not interlaced, so we don't need to worry about that, thank goodness. But if you take a look at the shot, we can see that it's got transferred full frame. So what we're going to have to do is remove a lot of garbage from this, because it's obviously going to trick the tracker. So go to image processing, and what we're going to do is we're going to make it so we're effectively cropping out the bad parts to do the camera solve. What we do is we're going to go ahead and drag this in and resize it, scale it down until you get to the point where you're removing the garbage in the scene. We don't want to see any of the edge of the frame or between frames, so we'll go ahead and click OK and load the footage into memory. And if we take a look at it, you can see now we've got the frame without any of the garbage. But if you look at it, it's obvious it's got a ton of distortion. Play with it. If you don't notice distortion, it's probably time for you to consider a new career, I would say. But you can see just a lot of it. We've got a little bit of garbage actually here on the top and the bottom. We haven't gone far enough, so we'll hit P and go in here. Crop that a little bit more. Now we've got cleaner edges. The vignetting the edge of the lens on the left is not a problem for us. So now that we have this, what we're going to do, you can maybe take a look at the automatic auto-distort or auto-discover the distortion. But in this case, Victor actually went through the shot and discovered it actually didn't discover enough distortion. The value of distortion that it discovered was not enough, so he had to actually go and do this manually. So instead of just walking you through that process, Victor thought we'd just mention that to you as an aside. You could try it with automatically and using the automated tools. But Victor's going to go ahead and just do the manual undistortion discovery, and also do this all using manual trackers because the shot's not that big of a move and so forth. Plus, it's just another option that you might want to do when tracking with that. So go ahead and go to the lens panel, and we're going to start adding the lines. And we've done this before a little bit. So I'll draw lines from one end to the other, and you can see actually how the curvature of the tiles on the ceiling don't match, and we're going to say this is not oriented. We'll go ahead and take this and do the same thing. Not oriented. Now it might be tempting to do a line here on the edge, and we'll go ahead and do this, and we'll show you in a bit what our problem is going to be. So we're not going to worry about that. So same here. This is a good line. So pick your lines in areas that are closer to the center of the frame while you're adding these. We'll go ahead and do this one as well. We probably have enough. Now let's just draw another one here near the edge to show you what happens when we start trying to remove the lens distortion. So now what we want to do is go ahead and here and dial in our lens distortion. And what you'll see here is our grid start to change, and you'll see the lines that we've drawn sent to bend to match the imagery within the scene. You can see those lines in the middle or start to line up with the actual lines in the original scene that was photographed. At this point, obviously, we're not bending the background, we're bending the pink lines. But check out these here in the line. You get some really, since kind of going outside the grid, you can see that it's creating way too much distortion on them and not working for us. So that's why we want to pick those lines that are in the center of the screen versus ones that are closer to the edge of the screen. they're going to give you a much better result in figuring out what kind of distortion and applying the undistortion to the scene. So what we'll go ahead and do is go ahead and kill and delete the lines, but we're going to go ahead and make a note of that line, minus 0.11000. We'll go ahead and hit P, and we'll go ahead and say get solver distort, and say yes. And then go ahead here and click OK, and our image prep will undistort the imagery. And so now you can see an image that is a little distorted, obviously, around the edges, but in the center screen you can see that our lines are straight, and it's going to be an image that is much easier to track, much better to track. We'll go ahead and delete all these lines from these scenes. The idea is here now that we have a scene that doesn't have any distortion, and we can go ahead and track it. Now let's go ahead and go to the manual tracker points and just start looking for trackers. And we've been through this before. Pick obvious points, which you should probably know by this point in the class what ones to pick. So go ahead and select it's probably a sprinkler. And that works pretty well, you can see. Go ahead and pick a point, excuse me, here. And again, the idea is we want to have the points as widely distributed as possible in as many different 3D planes as possible. So that will really help the solving algorithm if you've seen in the past. Again, this isn't really a difficult shot to track, right? This shot is our intention behind this, Victor's intention behind this is to actually show you how to deal with distortion within the scene. And sometimes when you're trying to do too many things at once within a scene, you kind of lose focus on what we're trying to learn. So that's why we're picking the shot that just has a huge amount of distortion in it. Go ahead and pick that. It's not on screen for long. Being as we're adding these trackers, we want to pick as many different points as we can. Again, some that are, he's got a lot of them kind of on the same plane here, but that's a good starting point. But they do have parallels based upon where they are. So now let's add one that's a little further back there towards the window. Go ahead and take that through. Again, this process is actually pretty quick. It doesn't take a lot of effort to go ahead and add these trackers. Go ahead and add these ones down here on the counter. It's not only Z depth, but I guess vertical position within the scene as well. There's a little bit of loss in this one. You can see it kind of jump. So go ahead and do what we've learned in the past. And let's do the auto set of keys and a little smoothing on it. And you can see now that we're able to track that a little longer. We don't need to do that on the first part of the shot because it was pretty stable up to that frame 115 or so. Let's go ahead and select this a little bit further back in the corner of the window. Okay. Just examine the shot for more points that we might want to pick. I think as you get more familiar with tracking, you'll kind of know where to add them, get the biggest bang for your buck, I would say, and where you're positioning them. So here's a good back wall one. And you're going to see that's got a great way here of having a problem. So we know as that object crosses there, we're going to go ahead and select that, turn that off, and then add another tracker here, which is the same point. And let's go ahead and go forward. Get that done. Now, as you saw in previous classes that we've covered, what we want to do is go ahead and come here to our graph editor and select both and do Shift 7. And that tells us that that point is actually the same tracker, which is incredibly helpful. You need to do that whenever you have a point like that, and it truly helps the camera, especially a track like that that's on visible for most of the shot. We'll go ahead and turn off this keying because that's actually probably not needed for most of these. Go ahead and play that through and see what happens. You know, the motion is pretty solid, pretty consistent. You don't have a lot of shaky camera moves and so forth, so you're not going to trick the trackers too often in this. It's going to be more the exception rather than the rule. Now just go ahead and go through this shot now, and what we're going to do is go ahead and stop the recording and pick a lot of points within this scene, because you don't really need to see us pick the various points. You're going to get the process here, but you can kind of start to see where the points that we're choosing are going to be. And so we'll go ahead and keep adding a few more trackers to the scene and stop it and start recording when we're done with that. Okay, so we finished adding trackers, and as you can see, it's not like a ton of trackers that have been added to the scene. You know, it's really, I haven't had to really overdo things, but basically the idea is selecting best ones that you could pick and in as many planes as possible. So if you pick the right points, you don't really need to overdo it. Let's go ahead now. You take a look at this. It's got a little bit of yellow there, but it's going to be okay. Let's go ahead and hit solve and see what happens here for us. That's very fast. And if we take a look at it, you can actually see we have a very low error rate, only 0.1967. If you take a look at the points, look at that. You can know that's the point that are back on the windows. You can see, especially there in the left view, they're kind of back there. If we select the ones here on the top, you can see they're all kind of on the ceiling. And then these are on the front column, closer to the camera. So it looks like we're actually pretty good here as far as the track goes. And now our next step in getting our scene prepped is to go ahead and align our camera. Before we do that, we would just need to find our camera, or take a look at our camera, and make sure everything is looking okay on our camera. So go ahead and open this up. Go take the camera, and what we're going to want to do is take a look at the solve path of the camera and see how much noise we have. And go ahead and zoom in here really tight, because we want to make sure before we take the time to do all the other stuff that we're doing in the scene that we've got a decent camera move. Go ahead and select those and zoom in a bit too far. Go ahead and take this back down. And as you get closer, you can actually see that there is quite a bit of noise within the camera, and it's actually not that jittery a camera move. You know, it's shot on a Steadicam rig. There's going to be a little of it, of course, as we talked about in the past. But this looks a little bit more than what we need. And it is very, very minute difference. You saw how much we had to zoom in on this scene. But what we're going to do in order not just smooth that actually camera path, what we're going to do is go ahead and delete the solution. And then we're going to go in and deal with our individual tracking points. So let's go ahead here. Go take a look at our active trackers. And the first step is going to be go ahead and select every single tracker that we have within the scene, and then apply kind of a smoothing to all the trackers, as a gang group. So select that and shift drag down. And then go ahead and we'll just go ahead and open up one of these to begin our zoom. Zoom in tightly so we can see that a little more cleanly and see how much of an impact that we're having on those. And you can see these are all the individual trackers viewed at once, and you can see they all have a little bit of news. So go ahead and open this to finalize them. Turn on live update and smooth them around. Now as we're doing this, we're going to back off the number of filter frames as well as the strength. Because again, there's this fine line between smoothing your trackers and getting a good result, and smoothing your trackers and getting something where it doesn't actually align with a true jitter or kind of natural manual different positioning between each frame. So you can go too far in your smoothing, so your camera moves very smooth and it's not matching the actual motion you're seeing. So go ahead and solve that again. And then let's go ahead back and open up the camera where we were before. the solve path. Zoom in on it. You can see that it's much cleaner. There is still a little bit of difference between the frames, right? I mean, because there's going to be naturally that kind of difference. But it's much better than it was before. So now if we take a look at the perspective view, you can actually see that it's looking pretty good. We'll play it through and see how much drift there is and see if it's actually messed up our track and made it worse. But it actually hasn't. And again, this is the case of being judicious in your use of smoothing. You want to get rid of some of the electronic error in it, but then match the realism and the reality of what was happening within the scene, in the camera, and the natural kind of variations that go on frame by frame. Now our next step is to go ahead and take a look at aligning the scene. So what we need to do is go ahead and kind of scroll through here and find a good frame to use to actually execute our line. In other words, a frame with lots of parallel and perpendicular lines. So we'll use this frame here, and we'll use our last frame. So go ahead here, and we'll go ahead and add lines. First, go ahead and align it on the countertop. We need to go in the camera view to actually do it, not the perspective view. So go ahead and add that line. And what we're going to say, this is going to be parallel to the y-axis. Go ahead and add another line here on this countertop. Select that. And we're actually going to make that our y-axis. The shelf is a good point for doing this. Go ahead and drag that parallel to the y as well. Find some other lines to do. Let's go ahead and pick this. Go ahead and drag up the window. This is going to be parallel to the z-axis. Go ahead and draw another line here on the edge of the window. And this one is actually going to be the z-axis. And then a couple other points here. What we're going to do is drag here along this countertop. We're going to see parallel to the x-axis. And then we're going to use the floor right next to the floor here, the board next to it. And this is actually going to be, let's adjust that just a bit. And this is going to be parallel to the x-axis. Let's go ahead and align here. Thinking. Get out of that view, go in our perspective view. And that's actually seeming as though it's pretty aligned. The grid seemed to be mimicking the geometry within our scene. Now our next point is to understand where the floor is, where the ground plane within our shot is. Because as you know, we haven't really tracked anything on the ground in any of the points we selected within Tracker. So now maybe is a good time to add that and find a point. And it looks like the wheel on the chair would be a good point for doing this. So go ahead and see where it's clear here. Add our tracker. Let's go ahead and go through, play forward. And as the guy steps in front of it, what we're going to want to do is go to our last good frame, turn it off, then go ahead and lock it. And then we're going to say that's a 0.8 tracker. By clicking the ZWT button, we'll say, okay, we're not going to influence our track. Other than a really good tip to do is go ahead and make a different color so it's easy to find. We know what it is. So again, 0.8, it's not going to mess with our sol. So we'll go ahead and hit refine at this point and go. And now that 2D tracking point that we had is now actually a 3D tracking point within our scene, or 3D point within our scene. What we're going to do, go ahead and select the camera. Go ahead and lock the camera. Select whole, and we've been through this before. What we're going to do is select our orange point and put that right at our 0, 0, 0 origin point. Okay, in all of our views, left, right, and front. Go ahead and switch back to perspective. Go ahead and look at this. And it's aligned pretty well. And that's exactly where we want the shot to be. The next thing we want to do is go ahead and add a couple objects in the scene and kind of confirm before we export that everything's working the way that we want it to. You know, find some points and some stuff just to test the scene. So go ahead and go here and add a few objects. What we need to do is go ahead and unlock, turn hole off, and then add a box here. Turn the creation tool. Go ahead and put a box in our scene. And again, we have a reference of where that point is. We know where that point is. Let's go ahead and we're going to add another object in this kind. Let's make it an earthling. We have a reference here as well. That second point there, that's kind of a height point, right? So what we're going to do is go ahead and add the earthling. Actually, we don't want to do it in that view. It's drawing the wrong. Go ahead here. Draw it here and position where that is in Z. And then make it tall. As Victor says, make it tall like he is. I don't know if you've run into him, but he is truly a giant among men, not only in the tracking world, but in the physical world as well. So go ahead and move that person kind of back behind those points, and you can, using our points from the top and the left view, you can see that they're located behind the people who are in our foreground. And then let's go ahead and see how this works here. Play through the scene. It's working really well for us. It seems as though our objects are nicely locked to our scene. All seems like everything there. Victor's happy, I'm happy, and now let's go ahead and export this for use in the 3D application. So our first step is to prep this footage for bringing in and working with it in the 3D application, as we're going to have to apply the undistorted background so that you can align it with the various objects in the scene and so forth. What we need to do is go ahead and hit the P button for the image preparation setup. And if you go in output, this probably does what you might expect. And we're going to save sequence. And you just basically pick where you want to save it, the type of sequence that you want to do. And then we're going to put the name. And we'll just call this export. And then what we're going to go ahead and do and add the amount of zeros you want and hit save. And then what we're going to want to do is go ahead and compression setting. That's fine. Start. And that's going to export a file sequence to your file system, undistorted as we see it here in the image preparation window. So then what we're going to go ahead and do and export the actual camera data and objects and so forth to your favorite program. And in Victor's case, his favorite 3D application of choice is 3ds Max. And he's got something really simple here set up through a couple boxes, as well as a little skeleton rigged man puppet. And again, this is just for fun to show some stuff. We'd love to see anything that you guys want to do within the class, and using this footage should be interesting to see. And obviously if we take a look at it here, we'll go ahead and drag here and render the frame. And what we're going to do is render the whole sequence, and you're just going to do it at the same output resolution as the input resolution. And we're going to make sure as we do an alpha channel with it, because we're going to do the compositing of this in a third-party application. And what we're going to do, once we get this straight render that's done here in 3ds Max, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to create distortion of this undistorted imagery when we're doing the composite and so forth. So let's go ahead and load the rendered sequence of this into Synthesize. So go ahead and switch over here to Synthesize. Open up our sequence. And find our 3ds render that we did, again with alpha channel, because we're not going to be doing the compositing here within Synthesize. What we're going to do is we're going to be effectively distorting the rendered footage that we did, rendered sequence that we did in 3ds Max. So go ahead and open this baby up. We're going to go ahead and you can see that we've got our normal size set up. And we're going to do something new is we're going to keep the alpha when we're working. And let's go ahead and click OK. And you can see our footage here. And then hit the P button, go to the lens, and now remember that number that we mentioned that you want to remember. That number we had was minus 0.11. And so you can see the footage, and what we want to do is say apply distortion. We want to apply distortion because we're not correcting for it. Go ahead and click OK. And now you can see the whole sequence has actually been distorted to match the setting that we had done with the undistort. So now we can take this footage and we could export the sequence out and then have it distorted for use in our compositing application. So you go ahead and save sequence, RGB, alpha. And obviously what we want to do here is probably do something that's uncompressed for our favorite format and go ahead and export that footage, and then we'll import it into another application for compositing, and we'll be ready to composite. Now, there are going to be lots of times that maybe you don't like using the lens distortion or whatever that's built, undistortion that's built into syn101. For instance, you have a third-party app or some kind of plugin that you like using. There's actually a pretty easy way around that, and that's by using a grid. And what you can do then with that grid is we're going to go ahead and create a render of the grid within syn101, and then we'll go ahead and match that visually in another application. So let's go ahead and do that now. We'll go ahead and load in a frame of a grid that we've got set up here. So you can see we've imported this image sequence. And then we'll go ahead and hit P. Go ahead and set our distortion to be minus 0.11. And then what we're going to do is apply distortion. And you can see now that we've got a grid that we can use to match in our external application. And what we'll do is we'll go ahead and bring in that grid in another application and kind of make it match or straight or whatever. So we want to do is save a sequence. In this case, you just go ahead and save a single frame as your reference for the lens distortion. And then you can do your distortion in another application if you want, if you feel the processing or the cleanliness of the distorter or undistorter is better than what you might get in syn101. Again, it's really up to you. People have their preferences when they're working on where they want to do their distortion, undistortion, and so forth. So let's go ahead now and going to go ahead and switch into After Effects and take a look at how we might composite the sequence. And you can see that we've got this loaded in. Basically, we've got the original background loaded in here, and the second layer has the undistorted render from 3D Max, and you can see that it doesn't match at all because of course you've got straight lines with no distortion. So go ahead and turn that off, and let's go ahead and pull down our rendered distorted version. This is the one from syn101. You can see that, go ahead and drag it down. You can see now that the distortion matches there. You can see that the curve of the box matches what you're seeing as far as the shells. But let's say you don't want to do the lens distortion that way. We're going to do it ourselves. What we'll do is go ahead and bring in that rendered grid. And this is the output, the single frame output or whatever you have from syn101. We'll go ahead to distort. Go ahead and go down to optics compensation here. And then start messing around with our field of view. And we're going to go ahead and reverse the lens distortion and drag this out until you get straight lines. We'll go ahead and turn on title safe, action safe. Again, we'll see that when we get that as a straight line. And now it's probably never going to match perfectly, and then especially here in After Effects, it's not. But again, we know, actually from Victor knows that the field of view is actually 79 on that. So copy that effect and paste it into the undistorted render. And again, you want to notice that the render that we have, the undistorted we have, with the optics compensation and After Effects composition, you want to make sure you have reverse lens distortion unclicked. And so now here we've got a good match from our undistorted scene. So there are two ways that you can deal with distorting your CGI renders from application. And of course, there are other applications that do this as well. So now you can just see that he's got a really quick mask here on the arm. A little bit of rotoscoping and so forth. You can do something similar within the scene if you want in order to integrate your objects within this scene. Again, just a good quick example of how you can, take a scene with a lot of lens distortion, undistort it, work with it, create your renders, and then reapply the lens distortion. We hope you enjoyed this lesson. Drop by the forums, ask any questions. Again, like last week, we'd love to see any work you do with the scenes. Until then, I'm John Montgomery for the professor in this, Victor Wolosky. Thanks for being part of FX PhD.